Where is it at? Oh, what are you thinking about changing the color of the? All right. Got a sandbox posted for today. We're going to talk about using Python for data processing. So at times we may find that the commands that are available at the command line, I mean, we talked about constructing pipelines to join various commands that do little small, single things, and they do them well. Sometimes you might run into the need for something that doesn't have a command for it. For example, I had an average script that was kind of handy because as long as you got a stream of numbers, you could send it to the average script and it would just calculate the average from that stream of numbers. What's that? Did it work? No.
I didn't try it.
So that's what we're going to do. Probably the simplest. I mean, Python is a language that has come about relatively recently. It's very popular. The popularity means that there's going to be a lot of support for it. A lot of people are using it. A lot of people are writing libraries for it. So it's going to be, you're going to find a lot of information with Python. It's become very popular, since I was in your position. When I was in your position, it was pretty much had to write C++ code. Python has come along and has removed a lot of the challenges associated with trying to write C or C++ code for simple things, right? You kind of have to learn a lot about the language before you can get very much accomplished in those C-style languages. It's very simple and powerful, like GNU plot in that sense. So that's what this module, I'm not gonna start from scratch and say, okay, we're gonna learn how Python works. We're gonna learn the Python language. We're just going to start using Python to do to write some simple stream type of programs. All right, so the first program we're gonna write is, of course, the Hello World program. You may have written this in another language. You may have written it in Python, but I am required by law to go through the Hello World program when introducing a new programming language. Now, the purpose of the Hello World program is a little bit lost on Python. It seems, trivial and stupid. But the purpose of the Hello World program in the past has been just see if you can actually get a program to run. Because actually getting everything that was required to compile and run a program on your machine was non-trivial. So you wrote a little Hello World program to prove that you could actually do that. So the purpose of this Hello World program is going to be, can we create the source file, which is Python? Can we make our file executable? And can we run that program? So Hello World in Python is fairly simple. You just print Hello World. The things that are going to be important, though, is we need a shebang, just like we did for bash scripts, and we need to make it executable before we run it. And when we run it, we have to use the relative path to that script.
Is it Python 2 or Python 3?
Python 2.
Yeah, you just download Python capital, or I guess 3. Like no, numeric.
Oh,
Uppercase 3.
Yeah.
Capital one's pretty.
yeah, Derek, that makes sense.
That's interesting. Could you use a lowercase 3 and get the same thing?
Well,
It's capital 3 like hash.
That's interesting.
numeral, obviously.
All right, so I'm in the sandbox here, and I'm just going to create my Hello World program. First thing I'll do is just show that Python is not like C or C++ in that Python is a interpreted language, which means that you write your programs in plain text, and then there's an interpreter that reads that file and then runs the Python commands. All these interpreted languages give you access usually to the interpreter. So if I run Python without any arguments, I get this command prompt. And this command prompt is reading Python commands and then executing those Python commands. So this is just like bash. If I run bash without any arguments, it opens up the command prompt and it starts interpreting bash commands. Python is much more specialized or geared toward writing sort of real programs than bash is, right? There isn't I wouldn't open up the Python command prompt to navigate my file system and modify files. Right? I'm using it to sort of test things. Yes, Derek?
So do we, when we're writing that original shebang, do we need to start with the backslash before the user?
Yeah. You got to give the absolute path to the interpreter that's going to be using it. So this is the Python interpreter, and you can see that I'm using Python 2.7.9. And if I do print hi, it prints hi to the screen. So this is the Python interpreter. If I want to get out of there, I type exit. All right, so the file that we have is going to be a list of Python commands that we could just type into the interpreter, right? Just like Bash, anything you can do in a script, you can do at the command line. Anything you can do at the command line, you can do in a script. Same thing's going to be true with Python. Anything that I do in a file, I could type out at the prompt if I wanted to. Corey?
What's the purpose of the parentheses?
The parentheses is because exit is a function, and it's a function that takes no arguments.
Does it need to be a .py file to run?
No, the naming is completely arbitrary. The shebang is what tells it that it's a Python file.
Okay.
So what we're going to need, and Python is almost always installed in the same place on all machines, but it's always a good idea just to check. What we're going to need is the location of the Python interpreter. So if I run the which command, it will tell me where the executable that is named Python is located. And I see that it is /user/bin/Python. That means if I were to go into the user bin directory and run ls, I would see Python listed in the output there. So this is different than Bash. Bash was in /bin/bash. This is in user bin Python. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to send that line there to a file. I'm going to create a file called helloworld.py. Derek has already asked, does it have to be named .py? It does not have to be named .py. That's pure convention. In fact, if you want to write commands that look like all of the other tools at the command line, then you could drop that extension and it would look like just a regular system command. The reason that the .py doesn't matter is because the system, I don't know at what level this occurs, maybe the kernel, reads the shebang to figure out what should interpret the file, not the extension to determine what program should get the file.
Because if you're using like Spider or something, it has to be .py, otherwise it will reject it as a
Yeah, exactly. So in that case, we have an external program that is trying to manage, like an IDE that's trying to manage your projects for you, and they will enforce some sort of naming convention. We're just going to write them in plain text using a plain text editor. I'm going to use Vim because I'm tired of using Nano. You guys use whatever it is you like to edit your plain text files. Absolutely no judgment, as long as it's not Emacs. Yeah, you can run Notepad++ in Wine before you run Emacs. That's not fair. I started off using Emacs. So I've got a file that's not empty. It's got this line in here, and I put that in there just so if I don't remember, right? If I haven't done this 1,000 times or 1,000,000 times, I don't know what the shebang should be. So I've got the name of the executable that needs to interpret this script. It does need to start with / because this is an absolute path to the Python interpreter. I need to comment that out and put a exclamation point after it. All right. So hello world is just going to be print hello world. I like to put a exclamation point at the end. It shows enthusiasm. Just gets you in the right frame of mind. All caps. Now we're talking. Now we're talking. I'll bet 50% of your tweets are all caps, aren't they? FML. All right. So when you have this written, just save it. Look at my directory here. There it is, helloworld.py. Now by itself, it doesn't have the executable bit turned on initially, so I do need to make it executable. This is almost identical to the bash scripts because we're basically doing the exact same thing. The only difference is the shebang tells the shell to use Python to interpret the file instead of bash. So I'm going to change it to executable, and then I'm going to run it just to see if it works, and it does. All right. Can everybody get their Python program to print hello world?
Yep.
Means we're all on the same page, ready to go. All right. One of the things that if this is your first programming language, then you won't notice this. But one of the things that makes Python really nice is that the syntax is much simpler than a lot of languages, mostly because there are a ton of languages that are based on the syntax that was introduced by C, which uses curly brackets and semicolons. And so Python uses indentation. One of the things that does is since you have to indent, you don't have to just follow some indentation convention to make your code more readable. It's I know it wasn't even planned. You have to indent, so your code ends up being more readable. Except for those people who hate indentation, then they say it's less readable, but it really is more readable. But instead of using brackets and semicolons, we're gonna have to pay attention to white space and colons. So the white space does matter in Python. It does not matter in C, which means the tabs and spaces, you have to know the difference between those. Like if you have something that is accidentally mixing tabs and spaces, then you can get some error that says that it's unexpected indentation. Even if everything looks like it's indented correctly, if one of those lines has got a tab in there instead of a space, Python is going to complain about the indentation because it's looking for white space characters that match. I just don't use tabs at all. Like I set up my text editor to insert spaces for tabs. You either have to use tabs or you have to not use tabs. All right, so Python libraries, most languages call them libraries. Python calls them modules. Modules are just pieces of code, usually pretty large, that somebody else has already written to do something useful. And pretty much anything that you want to do beyond print hello world, especially in our field, is going to require a module. So for example, the math module has functions that allow you to evaluate like the trig functions. So if I wanted to calculate what sine of an angle was or what cosine of an angle was, what I would have to do is import the math module. I'm not going to actually type this one up. If you guys want to type this up, make sure it executes, you're more than welcome. A couple of things to notice here is that the way that I import a module is with the import command. The name of the module is math. And then here I'm printing out a couple of numbers. So the print statement in Python 2, Python 3, it's a function. The print statement, similar to Gawk, will print out multiple things if you just separate them with commas, right? So I'm printing out 0, comma, math.sine. So sine is a function that's defined in the math module, but I have to use the math module name in order to actually use that function, right? It doesn't just bring everything into the global scope. So math.sine of 0 and math.cosine of 0. Neither one of these commands or these functions would work if I hadn't imported math. The math module also defines some constants that are useful, for example, pi. So math.pi will give you pi to several digits. So I'm going to evaluate sine and cosine at 0, and then I'm going to evaluate sine and cosine at pi over 2. So I know that sine of 0 is 0, cosine of 0 is 1. First line, 0, 0, 1. And then I know that at pi over 2, sine of pi over 2 is 1, and cosine of pi over 2 is 0. This isn't 0, but if I look at it, it's 6.12 times 10 to the negative 17. So it's basically 0. And that's something that comes up all the time when you're actually writing numerical programs, is that you get round off errors, and things that should be exactly 1 or exactly 0 are not always going to show up as exactly 1 or exactly 0. But this is so small that it's not going to matter when you do a calculation with it. Yeah.
tell it to round to certain digits?
We're not going to get to that, but yeah, there is a round function. But it doesn't do the same type of rounding that you would as a human do. It's a floating point round. It's just, yeah, some, you know, the limitations of the floating point representation. Oh man, what happened here? So, reading from standard input in Python is fairly simple. We're going to use a module. So we could read from standard input with the sys module. And what did it do here? Oh, I see what it did. This is supposed to be, this is the beginning of my code block. And it's all on one line for some reason. So this is just the shebang right here. I'm going to import the sys module. SYS stands for system. And then in the sys module is a standard in variable, I think. Basically contains all of the lines that are coming in from standard in. And so I can print standard input by just running a for loop on that. And I'm actually going to, I'll write this one because this is something that we're going to want to do. So let me go to my sandbox. What is today? 27. Let's do standard in.py. First thing I need to do is put in the shebang. This will be user bin Python. And I'm going to import the sys module. And I haven't talked about for loops, but we don't really care. All you need to know is that if I wanted to loop over every line that was sent in from standard input, this loop will do it. So for line in sys.stdin. And I got to put a colon here. Inside that for loop, I have to indent. So everything that's supposed to be looped over has to be indented from that for loop. So I'm going to do 2 spaces. And then I'm just going to print a string here that lets me know that this is actually printing from within the program and the line. So if I wanted to write a utility that did something like print off the first 10 lines of standard input or print the last 10 lines of standard input, like a Python implementation of the head or tail command, then this is the loop that I would do to get standard input. Every line that gets sent in is going to be put into this line variable.
What are those greater than signs doing? Is it just printing off that?
It'll just print off that string, yeah. That way I know that it's printing from the actual file. So I'm going to close, save this. I need to make this executable. And then if I just run this, it's going to start reading from standard input. So line 1, line 2, line 3. I now do Control D twice, and it prints out line 1, line 2, and it didn't print out line 3 because I didn't put a, there it is. There's line 3. Actually, I think what it's doing is it's still trying to read from standard input. If yours says, if yours says bad interpreter, it means you got a misspelling in your interpreter name. This or this? Yeah, let me show you how we will actually use this. So I'm going to cancel this. I can echo and then send it to standard input. So now it prints off that line that it got. If I wanted to send multiple lines, actually to get that, send in multiple lines of standard input, you can see that this script is basically just taking every line of standard input and it's printing out that line. So did you figure it out, Joey?
Hit the Control D and take it.
That's the new file character.
You have two
Yeah.
spaces there.
Ooh,
When I did that, it printed out what I had typed in, and then it started reading again.
I think two. There we go. That's just there.
It's the slash at the beginning of user that you're missing. Let me see here. Let me cat my file and see if Joey typed exactly what I had here. It's that piece right there. It will print out every line that it gets the text. So
Whatever you put.
like, let's generate some standard input for the command. Let's just cat. So I catted the standard in.py, and then let me just pipe that to standard in.py. So every line it prints out with these little greater than signs in front. Now you'll notice that what it's doing here, every line has got a space between it. That's because every line that we read from standard input has a new line character on it. And then the print command also prints a new line character after it prints everything. So we're getting two new line characters there. Working?
Let's go back into itself. Like 3 times.
Oh, just keep piping it. Derek, working?
Yeah.
Doran, working? What's your error message? Make sure your tabs and spaces aren't mixing, and make sure you actually indented underneath your for loop.
Oh, you should do a shit ton of spaces at the end of your script. Or a shit ton of inners. Yeah.
It's a standard unit, the ST.
And that shit don't carry.
Yeah, it's both. It's transcends all systems. Everybody, I guarantee you, everybody knows what that means. The ST unit. All right. One of the things that we're gonna, I mean, that's how we would read from standard input from just using the Python sys module. It turns out there's another module that's very useful if what you actually want to write is a stream, like a stream editor type of thing, like head, cat, tail, gawk. You remember that they all took file names, and if you didn't give them a file name, they started reading from standard input. It turns out that there's a module called file input that will do exactly that for you. So if you use the file input module and you loop over lines in the file input.input function, basically what it does is if there are any file names that are given as arguments, it starts loading line by line in every file, and then your script can process that. Or if no file names are given, it starts reading from standard input. So if you use this file input.input function instead of the sys.standard in, then you can automatically have your script work for files that have text in them or standard input. And so if and this one I suggest you write, because pretty much every other script that I write from now on is going to start with this module to do processing of the standard input. So it's file input. I'm looping over every line in the input. If I echo some text to that script, it just prints out every line. If I run that script on itself, so I give it a file name, it also works. Yeah, don't forget this one right here.
Don't forget the quotes after that second.
Yeah, no E in user. couldn't spare that character there.
And for slow timers.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they have to
In the
convert.
long
bunch of
run,
jummies.
they could- yeah, in the long run, it saves a few seconds. So,
Why is it now tab and then 2 greater than instead of 3 greater than?
I'm just changing it. So now it's going to indent every line a little bit, and it's going to put two greater thans there.
So what is the TAC E option to echo do to it?
That is telling it to take these. Like on my computer in my office, I don't require this, but apparently on this Linux Mint, I do. These new line characters by default don't get interpreted as new line characters, and they just print out as raw /ns. And then if I give echo the TAC E option, it will actually turn those into new line characters so that they generate 3 lines of standard input. So you should be able to echo text, like you could cat the name of the file and then pipe that to your script. Or just give your script or another file as an argument to your script directly, and it should print out the contents of that script. So this will be a good starting point for all of the programs tools that we want to write in this week's module. Got it, Derek.
Oh yeah, I've not had any problems so far.
Joey, what's the error?
not my error. He's got the error.
It's
Corey got a little error over there.
I've had a couple typos because I'm used to writing Python 3 now, so I've switched over to the I'll start writing, I'll finish up something, I'm like, oh wait, this is in the wrong formatting. And just go
The print command. How could you change the print command?
I know. Why would
So
you change?
fun.
They made me so angry. I'm like, this doesn't affect its function at all.
If you put parentheses around the print command in Python 2, it'll still work. It just looks funny.
No. In Python 3, the print command needs quotation, needs to be in print. Yeah,
Yeah, so if you do that in Python 2, it'll work.
but it doesn't work if you
It's not a
don't
print
print.
command anymore. It's a print.
Unless they do it right.
What did HTML do?
It's like they're trying to be a language this way.
Oh,
That's why that's awesome.
Try.
Isn't HTML the like web page one?
It's not a language.
I thought
Hey, we need help up here. That's not.
I thought that HTML was like an interface that you'd use to generate web pages.
Kind of sort of.
Yeah, like
We'll chat with
I thought it was more of a GUI than an actual code language.
It's not a code language. It's an markup language, like LaTeX.
Okay.
LaTeX is just like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought. That. I mean, I've seen HTML files, but they always just generate a web page.
Yeah. And also embed HTML components. That's fun when you start adding in JavaScript to Python. I typed the example
Like,
because then all stuff
JavaScript and Python?
That's one word.
Yeah, I was like, that's so singular word. Thank you very much. It's a proper.
No, JavaScript is not. No.
What? JavaScript's not a proper noun?
No, first it's insecure. Second, it's web-based.
It's not necessarily
What?
web-based, it's not have to be strictly web-based.
How do you have a web-based programming language that's a required internet access to work?
No, of course not.
It's just you run it in a browser.
It was developed.
No,
Have you ever gone into Google and looked at the properties of a web page?
No, C is not, C is the foundation.
My favorite was that you can go, if you go to like Google and you go to the if you pull up the properties of the web page, it'll actually take you to the source code of the Google homepage,
wait, what's this?
which is like,
QIC. No, that's it behind PHP.
yeah, luckily. And it's just this bring up this massive document.
Why would I want to learn PHP?
Because PHP wants to hear the login stuff.
I don't want to do PHP.
Well, what the hell, it didn't show up until, look.
No,
Yes,
no.
yes.
No,
I don't want you to hate Python.
I hate Python. I hate Python.
Then use R. It didn't show up until after I tried,
I'm not an actuary or an accountant or a statistician.
I'm none of those, I know like programming.
Tell a lot of
I don't know R. Hey, I don't know how to library anymore. Right now, the classes have to use Java and C. So last semester, I know Java. Trace back. And I use C earlier this semester.
There's not any problems, Joe?
Yeah, Corey and I both are, it's giving us just an attribute error. Line, line 5.
Okay.
Hold on. Hold on.
I saw it's not.
I copied it exactly at Java.
Well, obviously you didn't, because I copied it exactly. in what's
Line 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, so
Exactly like.
your fifth line is actually your fourth.
You don't have to.
Yes, and then I don't have to do it strictly that time. Because then.
So is this one 5?
No, your
Column
fourth
doesn't
one. Yeah, that's the first one.
Probably like Hooters or something. Or line in.
This is just an extra step. It takes 5 more seconds out.
But it's slow. It's a different file language. Yes.
Oh.
Python is interpreted like
Java's not bad. He said spaces work too, dude.
virtually.
Yeah.
Yeah, but still faster than Python, JavaScript. This
Next time's
Java's one of the biggest languages. What are the
I
3 billion devices?
Now it's actually returning a proper error message.
So that's what it said up there too. When I had just my space.
You can help websites in
Put my
Java.
space back and get rid of that
Okay.
tab.
It's saying
And
that
it's on the apps.
correct.
Oh, like.
That would type 2.
Oh, and
Let's see what there's.
four line and file language. How do you put? Hold on.
Your most popular programming.
Probably not. Let me pull up mine.
Well, how many programming languages there are? Let's see, Java, number
It's
1.
stating that that's incorrect.
Followed by
option.
C.
Wrong.
C#.
This is a song, Joey. Delete that file and file. and
JavaScript
you
made
want.
it top 10.
Delete it?
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
Windows ugly.
Wait a minute, is that the name of the script you're actually trying to write?
Yeah,
Swift
don't
does
say
not
it.
knock it out the. Along with.
don't name it that, name it something
Don't
Name
else.
something else.
And PHP is above JavaScript.
Yeah. It might just be trying to access
Swift
it.
is the.
I haven't been changing the name. I did
Yeah,
not.
Perl, Ruby, assembly spot. R, Visual Basic, Objective C, Go.
Oh, whenever I need a trash name, I just Joey.
MATLAB. Scratch is number 20. SAS, D, Dart, ABAP.
Well, also gonna be like IC file, what's that?
Fortran still at the top
Yeah, we
30.
need that.
Yeah, we tried changing the name earlier. That link won't be there.
Sequels.
Spits it out just fine.
F# is 32. Scala and Lua are colliding all that.
Hey, it ran.
Those are.
So F input, don't do F input.
Yeah, all of these are functionals.
I have like 5 different Python. So if I like search my computer for Python, it would pull up 5 different Python.
So
Why is it not working?
the reason it's not working is because Python allows you to write your own modules and load them into your program. And so if you have a file that's named like fileinput.py in the current working directory, it will import that and then overshadows the one that's on your system. If you delete it, but you still
trying to
got
import
this,
itself.
exactly. But you still got that PYC file, it's still not working.
Which would explain why the error message was returning your input.
Exactly. So now it works?
Yep.
I'm good.
Yep.
Yeah, you can't name your script anything that is a module that you want to import into your script.
Yeah, I really didn't. I was like,
Why you just give them dumb names like 42, GP, height,
what's the meaning of that?
life? Meaning of everything.
6 times 7.
All right.
It's my do everything command because Clark told me a story about it, so I named it after that.
So Python has support for variables, as we would expect. Basically, I mean, variables are going to be central to what we do. We're going to store data in variables, do calculation with those variables, set other variables equal to the output of that calculation. So the for command that we have in this, see if I can get this thing printed to the screen. Demos, no. Examples. There we go. So this line, say for line in the input, line is the name of a variable, as very similar to bash, where if you said for variable name in and you give it a list of stuff, the for loop would set the value of line equal to every item in that list. Same thing is going on here. We can use variables. So if we take this not called file input script, we take this script and we want to say, let's say we want to print out the line number before every line. Well, I start off by setting a variable I equal to 0. And now inside my for loop, I print the value of I along with the line that's being printed. And then after I print that, I change the value of I. I just increase it by 1. So I set I equal to whatever it is now plus 1. The other thing that I've added in this one is the dot strip call here. So line, the reason that we're getting blank lines printed between every line in the standard input is because all of those lines have a new line character and the print command prints out a new line character. The strip function on a text variable removes the white space at the end, so it'll take off that new line character. So we can strip off that new line character before we print it, and then we won't get blank lines printed between them. So the other thing that I will advocate you do, this will be our standard formula. We're going to use the file input module. We're going to loop over all of the lines of the input. We're typically never going to want that new line character at the end. So let's just throw it away first thing. So at the very top of your for loop, set line equal to line.strip. And that's going to strip off the new line character at the end of the line that gets sent into standard input. And then it's going to set line equal to that. So now we have a text variable line that doesn't contain that new line character at the end. It'll also get rid of any spaces. First thing, just get rid of the new line characters that come in. No blank lines? No blank lines.
You want us to do the print eye step too?
No, you don't have to. Check. Not going to. All right, the other thing that we're going to want to use here pretty quickly is conditionals. So just like in Bash, talked about if statements being things that allow you to execute certain pieces of code if some condition is true. All programming languages support this. Python syntax is if something that you want to know if it's true or not, right? So if line is greater than 0, print line. This is basically going to print out just lines that are positive, right? Or at least that's what we think it should be doing. So if I loop through all of the lines of input, say if line is greater than 0, print line. If I run this, so I send it some numbers, 0, 1, -1, and 2, I would expect 1 and 2 to be printed. But what I actually get is all lines being printed. The problem here is that this line is text right now, right? It's not being treated as a number. So all text that's not empty is greater than 0. What I need to do instead is get this text to be treated as a float or a number. And so the way I do that is, again, some jumbled garble of Python code. I wrap the line in a float function. So the float function will take input, and if it's a string, it'll return a number. That way that the if statement here is actually going to be comparing a number to 0. And if I run this command, I should now see the -1 and the 0 filtered out of that input. So this is a very useful, conditionals are going to be critical for doing any sort of filtering. Like if we wanted to get rid of all negative numbers or find the maximum number in a set of numbers, we're going to have to do some if comparisons. All right, so next time we're going to start on this, but I'm going to walk through the first activity that I have listed here. So we're going to write Python scripts that read standard input and do the following things. Not a Python script that does each one of these, but a different script for each one of these tasks. What we're going to try to do is build a collection of utilities that we could then use in pipelines. So print the maximum value in a stream. So if I get a bunch of numbers and I want the maximum value picked out, I'm going to write a Python script that does that. The minimum value, the sum of all values, the average of all values, that's the one that I wrote last module. The absolute value of all values in the stream. So the first one is going to require a conditional. So I'm going to go into the sandbox directory and I'm going to make a scripts directory just to store these scripts. And I'm going to send the Python interpreter's location to a file called max.py. That's the name of the script that I'm going to create. And then I'm going to change it to executable before I launch it or before I start editing it, so I don't have to close it to make it execute. First, I'm going to create a data file that I can sort of test this stuff with. So I'm going to put some numbers in a data file. And, oh man, that went fast. I'll now have the ability to take that stream of numbers and send it to my script. Then I can check that it's doing the right thing. So the maximum value here, I would expect my script to output 3. I had this Python interpreter string in here. I need to comment that out, put the pounds or the exclamation point there so that that's a legitimate shebang. I'm going to use the file input module. So I'm going to do import the file input and then loop over all lines of standard input, of input. First thing I'm going to do is set a variable up. So what my algorithm is going to be read every line of input and see if it's greater than what I have as the current max. If it's greater than the current maximum value that I have seen, set the max equal to that value. If it's not, skip it, right? And I'm gonna do that for all values so that when I get done, this max variable is gonna contain the value of the maximum number that I read in. So I loop over my lines. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to strip off that new line character. And then I'm going to get a numerical version of that. So I'm going to set a variable named num equal to float of that line. So that's just basically turning the line into a number. And I'm using the variable num to store that number. So the basic idea is if this number that I'm looking at currently is greater than the maximum that I've seen so far, then I need to set the max equal to that number. And then I go and read the next line and see if it's greater than the max. So if num is greater than max, then I just set max equal to num. When I get done, I loop through all my lines. I'm just going to print out that maximum number. All right, so now I'm outside of the for loop. This is after all lines of standard input have been read. I just print out max. So this should read in a bunch of numbers, find the maximum number, print that out. Save this and run. So here's my text file that I've got. So cat data.txt. I run that through my script through its standard input, and it prints out 3. Now, if you're paying attention, which probably Tyler caught this immediately, Patrick, Corey maybe, Joey, no way. Derek's already thinking about the next class. This isn't going to work if all of my numbers are negative, right? Because I set max equal to 0, and so if everything in the stream is less than 0, it's going to print out 0 for the max. So what I really need to do is add a condition to check if I've actually found a maximum first, and then start setting the max, which we will do next time. You guys better get over there. I'm sure the quiz is already being administered.
That's coming up soon.
Yeah, scores.
Well, let me know about
It's
it, but like
It's considering that it's a conceptual variable, just meant to represent significantly larger values. Like it's just a variable with characteristics.
So could you set